in the visits that we undertook to some police forces, it is clear that it is still happening. I obviously have gone quite hard, and I'm conscious that there are more legally qualified people sat around the table than myself, but I have gone quite hard on the fact I think we really have to get a grip of how we treat children. This again dates back to Rotherham, where I listened to the testimony of a young woman there. She was a child at the time that was multiple raped by multiple men on multiple occasions as a 13th birthday present, in the knowledge that her perpetrator said it would be not seen as rape, which she believed. So I've always sort of thought, why do we have this sort of difference when from 12 to 13, and why do we have that? And I'm sure there's a myriad of good reasons why people historically did, but I think it's time to draw a line under that and see children as children. And I think if we did that, that would have more profound implications across society anyway. And I think there's lots of people out there worrying about lots of other things to do with adolescents and teenagers. And I think this would just be one very sort of clear historic law change that I feel, given we haven't looked at rape law since 2003, I think it is. I think the time is right to do that, and it would be a very fitting outcome, I think, to the audit. The other thing I wanted to just put in some context is I'm calling for, and they have agreed to, a national police operation. I think the big thing I want to happen is a national criminal operation. I suggested, and they've agreed, it's led by the National Crime Agency. That's in part because Stovewood, which is the NCA, were brought in to South Yorkshire Police in 2014, actually after Alexis Jay's report, not mine. I was there when Stovewood arrived, and I can see over their years of doing good police work that they've built up a very high level of expertise, which actually you can see other forces could benefit from, and it would also give confidence to victims. And really that's my sort of big ask, I suppose, is that. There's an irony, but anyway. And then the second part of that, and what I envisaged, was a sort of independent commission that would grasp the two. So you'd have a police criminal investigation, and then obviously I have asked for, and they have agreed to do, a national inquiry where I want very strong footprints locally. I want it to be a different type of inquiry to perhaps things that have happened before. And I do see a link between those two. I think that they should feed into each other. The national data on grooming gangs is, sound not often accused of being a civil servant, but incomplete and unreliable is what is written here. I would say that's putting it mildly. And I feel very strongly on issues that are as searing as people's race, when actually we know the prejudice and racism that people of colour experience in this country, to not get how you treat that data right, actually I think is a different level of public irresponsibility. Sorry to put it so bluntly, I didn't put it that bluntly yesterday, but I think it's particularly important if you are collecting those sorts of issues to get them 100% right. And if you are not getting them 100% right, please don't use them to justify another position, which is potentially what happened. So, and that may be well-meaning, it may not be well-meaning, but that's how the data has run. And I think the sooner we bring a close to that, and either, my view is collect something or don't collect something. For God's sakes, don't half collect it. That's a bloody disaster, frankly. And so then, I think it's a matter now of public record. We dug deeper into 3 police force areas where there's a clear higher rates of child sexual exploitation offending, and dug deeper into those to see whether they had established the facts and figures, and they had established the facts and figures much more than the national data. That then meant I was somewhat tougher, actually, in the way I've just talked about the national data, because if I know it can be collected in large police forces effectively, why can't I collect that nationally? Do you see me added to the sort of sense, oh dear God, what on earth have you done here? So I think it's clear that if you look at those three large police forces and their data, one is historic, to be fair, the other two are live, then the disproportionality issue is clear, and obviously they ask for, when they ask for ethnicity, they largely, one stops at Asian, the other stops at Pakistani heritage. And again, I can only feel the pain of those communities to know that it's all bundled together in one big grouping, and how unhelpful that is to the very communities that you are talking about. So again, I think that that's not a great way for public policy to be done, even if it's... And I went into other less scientific ways of trying to see what was going on with serious case reviews, which we can come to, which is a matter, it could be a subject topic for your fellow committee all of its own, what's happening in the world of serious case reviews and children's data. But we went there and examined that. Just as a note of caution, when we asked the good people of Greater Manchester Police to help us look at the data, we also collected, I think it's in the report, what was happening with child abuse more generally. And of course, so if you look at the data on child sexual exploitation suspects and offenders, it's disproportionately Asian heritage. If you look at the data for child abuse, it is not disproportionate, and it is white men. So again, just note to everybody really outside here rather than in here, let's just keep calm here about how you interrogate data and what you draw from it. I think I've said that I think the sort of poor recording in the criminal justice system, but not just in the criminal justice system, we have strong views, which you've seen in the audit, about children's services and local authorities and this extraordinary change, your Home Affairs. So you've got crime recording of child abuse here going up, and you look over at colleagues in local government, in children's services, and certainly see that in, I think, children on child protection plans for sexual abuse is at an all-time low in the last 30 years. And, you know, we thought, why are we the first people to open that cupboard and have a look at it? Because that tells you something, that if you were trying to sort this out, you might have a different view of it. And I often think that the Department of Health get a hospital pass, pun intended, just bringing a note of levity into a serious session. But, you know, honest to God, the national or absence of national data from the Department of Health world is woeful. Mm-hmm. And the one thing that you will know as Home Affairs colleagues is that quite often victims are actually all there in the health world, and sometimes the health world gets those people to our world so we can prosecute the people that are harming them. And so it really is an important issue that this isn't just something that's for the Home Office or for the Ministry of Justice. I think there's a responsibility on the Department of Health and the Department of Local Government, and very much the Department of Education, not to see this as something that's down in, you know, a bit of 2 Marsham Street. And I'm worried about that because we've talked about it relentlessly. I don't think this is the first Select Committee or Public Accounts Committee I've been before asking for better sharing of data between services and agencies. And I think I put in one of the recommendations, we need to look at how we make that mandatory, and therefore if something isn't mandatory or people don't do it, what consequences are they going to face this time round? Because it strikes me that it's not done. Now, part of that is, and again, I'm sure you know this possibly more than I did, that I didn't realise until I went back in to do this audit at the sort of paucity really of technology to support the police in what they're doing. I didn't realise that, you know, I was there when the tragedy of Sohan happened, and that we knew at that point that if we'd had better data sharing, there's a possibility that we might have saved those girls' lives. There's certainly an absolute clarity that intelligence would have been much faster in order of either avoiding it or actually finding that dreadful human being earlier. And we've known that forever onwards. And so I think there is also an issue, which is I just feel that, you know, the Home Office can't drag their feet on, sorry, that's a bit tough thing to say, but they shouldn't drag their feet on looking at police intelligence systems, given we're living in the 21st century, and that probably everybody in this room could connect within seconds. Yet we had Bedfordshire Police rightly finding a young boy, as it happened, that was being, in my mind, trafficked to London, but the data intelligence system didn't make it easy for them to find that he was in Deptford and being circled and dealt with by predators. And so I just found that hard to understand, and I realise it's not a big, massive issue to the public necessarily, but it's a very big issue for the system. And then the last thing I wanted to say, if I may, Dame Karen, is that, you know, none of the issues in the audit, sadly, are new. And actually, I felt that other colleagues possibly could have found that if they'd looked harder before us. You know, we didn't do anything particularly clever. We just put together the facts as best we could and presented them in as straight bat as possible. So that always causes me a bit of concern. I like to think I'm clever sometimes and find something new, and most of the time, as I head into 40 years in public service, you find the same thing, and what you have to do is be brave about dealing with it. And I suppose that's the last thing I wanted to say, is that, you know, the tone that we need to set is that we need national reset when it comes to children and when it comes to child abuse, and within child abuse, child sexual exploitation. And I think that's why I've put together a sort of package of recommendations that include consent through to sorting out taxis, with, you know, a national criminal investigation and a national inquiry sandwiched between the two. I hope that's a helpful start.
No, thank you very much, and that helps to set the scene for us and our questioning. And I think I read your report and felt rather unwell as to just how much of this was familiar and hadn't been joined up, and that is a great frustration for all of us who serve in public life. We are cross-party, but we are a team working together to try and establish how we can help scrutinise government and the work of the Home Office. And with that in mind, colleagues are very acutely aware that this is a very serious issue, and one that is not one that we need to start having tribal party politics involved in. So I'm going to start the questioning, and I'd like to start with Jake Richards.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for all your work, Baroness Casey and your team. I mean, it's quite an exceptional piece of work in a short period of time, which must have been very difficult to put together. So very grateful. What comes across in the report and in your opening statement, in particular your personal note, Baroness Casey, at page 11, is just the kind of extreme sense of disappointment, and that word is probably mild, and you could have used stronger language at what you found. I just want to get a sense of the evidence base for that disappointment. What are we talking about? How did the audit, in broad brush terms, realise that things had certainly not improved as you'd wish from your experience in Rotherham?
Well, I might ask if you want sort of machinations of what blocks of evidence we put together and how. I might ask my colleagues to help with that. But I would direct you, Mr. Richards, to a very long timeline that is in the beginning, which shows just the amount of times people post 2009 actually. So it was 2009, which was the first government statutory definition of child sexual exploitation. And then we didn't sweep through, we carefully went through all of the different, it's not complete, there's more in there. I've had some people since say, well, I did a documentary then, why that wasn't included yesterday. So I'm sure we could go on and on and on with it. But so we did a very big look at who, it's always the same. You look at who's gone before you, why things didn't change, what stopped them from changing if you can, and piece together, is this something that we've all had did it just need putting together? And once you put it together, people go, oh, good God, we should have all known. Or whether actually, the data speaks for itself. We did I mean, it's almost impossible to get through. I feel sorry for anybody trying to read this report. But, you know, going through chapter by chapter on sort of nature, scale, definitions, you know, we literally went through and looked at all of the definitions. We spared you the multiple appendices that we could have attached to it. to show just how many times people have looked at definitions, they've looked at strategies, but we haven't got to the nub of it, and I think that's partly the problem. So yes, we did a lot of homework. Does that answer the question? Or is that not quite
so. I understand. I mean, the 17 pages that the Home Secretary referred to yesterday in her statement of setting out the background of 17. The work that has been done and the chronology is a must read. But what I guess I'm asking is, the audit presumably didn't just read that and then look to see whether the recommendations had been implemented. Presumably you spoke to survivors, victims, people on the ground, and I just want to get a sense. I know it's very difficult in terms of what you heard back from them. Obviously some of it is touched upon in the report, but it would be really good to have a bit more...
For victims.
For victims and survivors.
Victims and survivors are really angry that things haven't changed sufficiently for the children that are there now. I don't think they feel confident in what's going on at the moment. And I think a lot of them are still carrying some of them open criminal investigations that have gone on for years without any sense of closure. And I think, remember the backdrop here is when children are small, we as a society and a state have eyes on them. I think it's this really important thing. It's not just about crime, but more generally. Like when kids are born into the world, normally they're born in a hospital, so we see the parents. Then there's health visitors, so we continue to support and see the parents. Then they go to schools and nurseries where the class sizes are small and they have one teacher that can do pastoral care. Age 11, quite rightly, they move to larger schools where they're in a much bigger situation because they have to grow and be independent. This is all about not treating them as children until they're suddenly 18. But for the state, it means our safety net changes. And I think we overall don't see, the fact that as they get older and where they are in our care, as opposed to their parental care that has failed, we therefore ought to double down on the people around them that are the predators that come after them. So the guilt that they feel as survivors about being called wayward, about knowing that nobody cared about them, the fact that their parents weren't watching a 24-hour find a friend to see where they were and what pub they were in. Some of them have criminal
convictions as well.
Some of them have criminal convictions because we decided that because she was told by said bloke to bring her friend, that then we do her for child abuse offences herself. I mean, this is and obviously we decided, the audit, I went beyond the terms of reference of the audit because I felt, partly because of Rotherham, that we owed it to both look at what the victims were saying and doing and then to meet some. And so obviously we did some meetings with victims.
I'm one of 3 Rotherham MPs. Obviously you met with victims and survivors from across the country. Perhaps you won't comment on Rotherham specifically today, but I wondered whether you or your team could meet with me and other Rotherham MPs to discuss any current and live issues about Rotherham that might be helpful for us to follow up as well.
I mean, we're obviously happy to do that. I think we've got to be careful, I've got to be careful not to overstep my position in terms of respecting the process that now happens, which is, it's the safeguarding ministers, whom I'm sure you know well, who leads for victims, and I wouldn't want to get in the way of those things. But, I'm not going to walk away from this issue for the rest of my career.
And just finally, in terms of your recommendation for a national inquiry, clearly you've said in media interviews that you changed your mind on that. Was there a specific part of the evidence base that made you come to the conclusion that this was a necessity?
Very much so, yes. So, it's not like anybody publicly asked me my view, incidentally. I wasn't on the record somehow giving media interviews saying, I don't know, I was busy worrying about actually social care post-Christmas. So, I had other things on my mind. So, but that said, I was of the group, and I said this to Downing Street, which is, you know, when we're in a discussion about it really early on, I think I would have said to anybody that asked me, do we really need another national inquiry? Alexis J did a 7-year inquiry. It was pretty thorough. I followed Alexis into Rotherham all those years ago. She's a pretty thorough lady. And I was of the view, because I've also written reports that haven't been implemented, perhaps we ought to implement the recommendations of her report before we start thinking about anything else. So I was definitely there, and I own that. Now, during the course of the review, it became abundantly clear on a number of fronts that if we didn't have a national inquiry as opposed to just a series of local inquiries, then we wouldn't get to the issue of accountability. And so as much as I think those of you that have got some knowledge of me around the table will know that I, like finding criminals and I like locking them up for a very long time. And if I was going to spend money on anything, I spend money on more prison places and more police officers. So I'm pretty tough on crime. And so I also had to be convinced that we needed what at some level I was thinking, if I'm going to ask the public to spend money on anything, do you know what? I think I'll go and get some more criminals. So that's very much was my position. And then during the course of the audit, a few things came to light very, very clearly. First of all, when they made an announcement in January that they were asking, had at least the money for 5 areas to do local inquiries, and that everybody would somehow come forward and vote, decide to do these inquiries. Only Oldham bit the bullet, and that's how I describe it, and said, yep, we want to do a local inquiry. My understanding is nobody else volunteered for that. So that tells you something, doesn't it? That tells you something, and it doesn't tell you something I certainly would want to hear if I was a victim. Then we head into looking at some of these reviews. There's a number of comments made. The most important one at this point in the chronology is I couldn't understand why Andy Burnham was asking for a national inquiry. So in amongst everything else, we looked at his assurance reviews. So Andy Burnham, quite rightly, in my view, did a bit of what I'm doing, which is he thought, this stuff is going on in Greater Manchester. I need to be assured, he called them assurance reviews, what's going on in Rochdale, what's going on in Oldham. I need to see what the police are doing, and he'd had actually victims and Maggie Oliver in a big meeting in whatever it's not the town hall, but whatever his place is in Manchester. And they'd all agreed that people had to be held to account. We had to find out the truth. We had to find out where decisions made. If you look at the assurance reviews that he had done, he was so frustrated, and so would I have been, so were the people that did those reviews, that it took years. Nobody shared data. They were all lawyering up to fight over who would share what data. And, that I put it in more mild terms in the report, but when it came to report 3, which I think was like 4 or 5 years later, the guys resigned and the thing was handed over to sort of a statutory body in the National Inspectorate and Ofsted. And so I thought to myself, okay guys, come on. Nobody's volunteering to find the truth here, and we owe these victims that. Secondly, you see extremely important assurance reviews by Greater Manchester Mayor, who's one of the long-standing mayors, knew what he was doing. He couldn't get to the bottom of it. And then you look at the 50 serious case reviews, and you look at the world of serious case reviews, and you see that, to be honest, Mr. Richards, they do not get to the truth of what happens in these cases. What they do is, has the team around the child operated effectively? Now, that's really important, don't get me wrong, but, part of the team around the child are the perpetrators, who spot that the team around the child isn't good enough or can't safeguard that child enough. Do we talk about the predators in any of these serious case reviews? Did we know about these predators? Were we properly safeguarding the children? Sorry, you can tell from my tone. I said to everybody, I'll be really measured. Don't worry, I won't get, like that about it. But when you start talking about this, you think, yeah, that's why I want a statutory inquiry. And that's why it has to be national with strong local there's a connection between the local and national. So I know it's not what everybody wanted, but I think it's absolutely the right thing to do.
Just finally, recommendation 12 is about funding. Predominantly, you mentioned money for prisons, you mentioned money for police officers. I mean, have you had any assurances that there is going to be funding for this going forward, or is that a recommendation and you wait and see from government?
Well, the recommendations, all 12 of them, were accepted unreservedly by the government yesterday, and I put recommendation 12 in deliberately to ensure, apart from the fact I only like even numbers, but leaving that, I'm in that mood today, aren't I? I can tell. It's a really important thing to make sure that we don't let the victims down again by not doing this properly. So, having gone from, is this the right way of spending public money 4 months ago, I think it's the right way to spend public money. We made it a recommendation so that, in 6 months' time or 2 months' time, people such as yourselves are able to ask the government what has happened with that recommendation, because it means every time people double check on the recommendations, their implementation, one of them will be on money. But to be fair, we only gave them a report about 10 days ago, and they were out yesterday responding to it. So I'm sure there's detail on each one of those recommendations that has to be worked through.
Thank you.
Ben Maguire.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks, Baroness Casey, and your team for such fantastic work and for turning this around so quickly. Just picking up on the Alexis J recommendations, I noted from your executive summary that you've kind of assumed those recommendations are now going to be implemented. We've obviously had lots of reviews dating back to Lord Laming in 2009. The Alexis J review, I think, took 7 years. Now you're proposing another national inquiry. My big concern is constituents like mine, Nigel O'Mara, who was a victim of child sexual abuse, reliving these experiences over and over again. He's told me that he's had severe mental health issues and trauma having to relive that during the Alexis J inquiry. Which of these J recommendations are you most concerned about not being implemented? Because I know you've kind of worked on the basis they will be, but are there any out of that list of 20 that you're concerned won't be in the near future?
Well, I think there's a couple, isn't there? The Child Protection Authority. The government have said that they're going to do that, but I suppose that's one of the major themes in the work that we've done, and that obviously Alexis J did, was the importance of bringing those different safeguarding policing systems together. And if we don't do that, we're going to continue to have this problem of, in these sorts of cases, the need to go out and look for evidence to protect children proactively and those sort of things. You won't get that without a very, very sort of strong child protection arrangement, which is more than a safeguarding partnership, which may not, in practice, work kind of operationally as well as strategically together. So I think that would be the kind of, from what we've just done and looked at this, and what, as Baroness Casey says, that the history of many of these reviews tells us is that's what we've got to get sorted.
And there's no reason technically anymore to make that difficult. Yeah. So the sharing of data is probably easier now than at any time in my entire career. And so I think that some of the, and it's not expensive, it's just getting the safeguards around privacy right. But I think often we use the safeguards around privacy to protect our own agency interest and not share data. So she was right about that, and we totally support it in what we found.
Just quick follow up on that. I noted that recommendation 7 in your report calls for changes to the way police share data across boundaries. I'm thinking particularly in my own area of county line drug gangs, which you referenced at the start. Yeah. You mentioned that it needs changes, but you don't go as far as to say that it needs a whole new IT system for policing. How can you square the circle there? Because it feels like there needs to be an overhaul, there needs to be a completely new system in place to make sure we avoid these things slipping through the cracks at police boundaries.
Well, partly, you've got, police IT systems tend to evoke lots of sighs and rolling of eyes, and I don't know how many police systems that we've seen, big IT ideas that haven't quite, materialised as they planned. But some of the kind of good work that we've seen For example, the organised exploitation team that is funded by the Home Office, and some of the kind of action taken in other areas means you don't actually have to create a whole new IT system. You can now use you can use all sorts of tools to read existing systems. So this is not like 40 years hence we've got a new system and everyone's going to switch on and it's going to work. I think it's modern technology. I think probably allows for that to happen. So I don't think we're waiting for a brand new IT system, and we've seen plenty of sort of good arrangements in areas which have kind of overcome that, and the kind of TOEX schemes are really helpful at developing tools to help people do the job, police do the job they need to do rather than waiting.
I think that, my living nightmare is if you say to any large statutory organisation, dare I say even the civil service, I tell you what we need is a big digital overhaul. The coffin of that 2 or 3 years down the line is I've never been asked to audit that, but I'm sure I wouldn't have to look very far. So Sarah's absolutely right. Bedfordshire Police, for example, small but mighty, have piloted a really straightforward way of doing a police intelligence database. The TOEX thing is there for the taking. It's like what we didn't want to do is give everybody an excuse to say, we can't do all of this because it's going to take us 300 years and £300 million to have a think about it. No, there are things right there, right now, that both tech companies can offer you, but you've also got expertise in your own organisation. So can we crack on and do it, please, rather than spend 300 years having a digital overhaul that won't overhaul anything?
Thanks.
Jenny Reid.
Thank you for your audit and report, and also thank you for coming here today and this morning. We really, the whole committee really appreciates it. I'm a Scottish MP, and the vast majority of not just what's in your report, but Alexis J's recommendations as well are covered devolved issues. But much of what's in there, like a lack of mandatory reporting, gaps in data, could equally apply in Scotland as well. And I'm a bit concerned that it's not getting sufficient attention, scrutiny north of the border, and that we don't have a kind of similar push up there. And I want to be kind of reassured that isn't the case. Do you have any thoughts on that? While you were doing your audit, were you contacted by, or did you communicate with any Scottish organisations or indeed any devolved institutions?
I don't think we did. I mean, I think something to do with Glasgow has just passed through my mind, but I'm not entirely sure why. But there was certainly a case in Glasgow. I think what I would say to anywhere in our country is don't just read this report and think it may not happen to you. I think it's quite right what Mr Maguire said. Places like Cornwall, until county lines came on the map, may not have been places that this type of exploitation might have been so obvious in. It might have been, it might not have been. So I think, and also Police Scotland, of course, is Police Scotland. So you merged your police forces several years ago into one Police Scotland. So your data sharing should be technically more effective. No, it's not. Okay.
They still have the old IT systems.
Then they should have less of a barrier to merging those databases and having something over the top that would be helpful to them. But even if they were to do that, what you've then got to do is get all of your local authorities and your health sector on board to share data about vulnerable children. Now in Scotland, frankly, that should be easier given the size both of your population and your statutory sector than trying to do it across the whole of England. But it's often the cultural barriers that get in the way, not the logistical barriers. So I'm sure it's an issue for Scotland.
Just to say, in terms of other devolved areas, we spoke with colleagues in Wales where there's the patterns are kind of pretty similar in terms of children's services and sharing. So it was interesting that although the systems are slightly different, the kind of the picture was similar.
Do you have any thoughts on whether the National Inquiry should have kind of official input from devolved governments so that we can get this broad brush learning across the UK? Do you have any kind of...
I would be disappointed if the opportunity of the national criminal investigation, because let's face it, I can move from Scotland to England pretty easily, and criminals do, so that would be a missed opportunity. And alongside that, therefore, so would at least the learnings of the National Inquiry, because what I've got in my mind is something that is slightly different to a sort of 7-year judge-led inquiry, and I think that what ideally we would have is something that got into local areas, and it's a matter for Scotland to decide, isn't it, whether they would want to have some sort of relationship with the National Commission or Inquiry or whatever it ends up being called. But criminals move to wherever they can get their prey. And with the internet, they do that even quicker and easier. I mean, it's an issue internationally, not just between the devolved nations. So I think it is really important that across certainly Northern Ireland, Scotland, Wales and England, there's some join-up around these sorts of issues. And that's where my sort of, perhaps over-obsession and a nerd level with getting the IT right is a really pragmatic way of joining up those systems. Which, given where we are, even I understand with this pen and an ink pen, I understand how easy that is now as opposed to even 2 or 3 years ago.
Just, if I may, just as an observation, in some of the bigger police forces in England that we spoke to, the Met Police, for example, and Greater Manchester Police, they are taking an approach where they apply serious and organised crime tactics and operational approaches to child sexual exploitation successfully, and that helps them to corral, if you like, the local police organisation within their much broader area, so they have an oversight of what's going on. They talk to their districts and they bring everything into the centre and apply more resourcing where there are complex cases. It may be something that policing in Scotland are already doing, but that is an approach that we endorse and recommend is applied more widely going forward.
I agree about the IT systems and how crucial that is, but if you're not collecting accurate, robust data, then it doesn't really matter what IT system you have, right? So can you talk a little bit more about the gaps in the data? You did mention ethnicity, but are there any other kind of egregious examples that you think that we should remedy now? I mean, it seems to me extraordinarily urgent that we start collecting robust, comprehensive data now, otherwise it will affect the National Inquiry. Did it affect your ability to perform this audit effectively? And what did those challenges look like?
Yes, it did affect our ability to...
would imagine.
Our job was to assess the scale of group-based child sexual exploitation, and in that we have not been able to provide an answer because of the data systems, and it sort of also starts right from the it starts kind of from the fact that we don't have a kind of robust, up-to-date prevalence survey, so we don't know how much child sexual abuse there is in the country. There's a few sort of reasonably educated estimates, but we don't have anything up to date. The last one was like 12 years ago or something that was accurate. So you can start at that point, and so how many, what are we looking for, kind of how much is going on, and then we can see what services, whether people are coming to services or not. So that's your first point, is that we estimate 500,000 children a year are sexually abused in a kind of the kind of umbrella way of sexual abuse in different forms. And then beyond that, we have the next piece of information down is the policing reports of child sexual abuse. Some of that is flagged when it's child sexual exploitation, but police flags are notoriously poor. They're not used well, and when we talked to police forces and we looked at their problem profiles, we found that the flags weren't being used that well. So there's an estimate that tells you that there are 17,000 CSE crimes a year. But we can't rely on that necessarily. And so 2 years ago, the Child Sexual Exploitation Task Force, which is kind of a national policing capability, started collecting, asking police to send them their data, and they are kind of basically analysing it manually, effectively, to look at the number of child sexual abuse cases which fall into the sexual exploitation and are carried out by more than 2 people. So that's what they have to do, like kind of incredibly difficult and labour-intensive exercise. And that told us there were 719 group-based child sexual exploitation crimes in 2023. Now, you know, so we started up there half a million a year, and we get down to 700 crimes. We think, we think for a start that because most child sexual abuse is not reported anyway, we have a massive underestimate of what's happening. But that's like the best we got after however many years of saying we really need to collect this information.
What needs to happen now to ensure that this doesn't happen in the national inquiry? Have you got any thoughts on?
Well, I think just to start on the CSE task force are planning. The government have accepted that they will collect more. They will collect data in a more robust way. So we will get some of that, and I think we've said that we need mandatory ethnicity collection of data when it comes to child sexual abuse, and the government have accepted that. So it's not. I think it's probably not mandatory. So totally mandatory at the moment. It's all done by encouragement. I think it's
all done by encouragement at the moment. I mean,
but we think it needs to be mandatory.
I mean, to be fair, it's Theresa May as Home Secretary. I think a bit into her term that wanted the flagging process, and she wanted that flagging process because, having said at the beginning of her term, you know, press on. She realised, I think, I'm not speaking for her, incidentally, I haven't asked her this, but my judgment of what she did was think, I need to get across CSE. And so you then introduce this flagging process, because, of course, when somebody is arrested, the series of crimes that you are labelling are quite complicated. That said, all of these years later, for that not to have been implemented more effectively, I draw a conclusion from that you know, that's not good enough. And then I put that together with where we are in 2025 and think there must be better both technical and other solutions to how you would get that right, if you really wanted to.
I'll stop there, Chair, just to allow others.
And I very briefly attended a session last week. I was in between meetings, but I popped into an APPG on missing people, where I understand there's a different approach to missing being piloted in Scotland at the moment around return interviews and recording of data, etc. It's always felt to me that, and you've referenced it in the report, that missing, because of the lack of consistency around the way police record it and the way that local authorities perhaps consider it, those children who are missing are the children who are being exploited for county lines, who are the children who are being exploited by grooming gangs. It feels like, you know, and you talk about 10 years ago, we were trying to put this together 10 years ago and say, you need to join this up.
So I think one of the things I think I'm hoping that such a big move on consent is the reason I'm pushing for it is because it's symbolic of what we think about children. So I think the way we come at missing at the moment, and you know, and this is good people trying to do it, feels very much in how many times has somebody gone missing, and are we getting the returning interviews right? So it feels very transactional, and it's missing a bigger point, which is, I hope that if anybody has teenage girls and adolescent girls in the room right now, if they disappeared overnight and they switched their finds a friend off, you would be beside yourselves, absolutely beside yourselves. But because we're dealing with kids that haven't come from that, we as a state attempt to have a safety net And that safety net doesn't see that missing, so even though it's an important thing and you have missing task force and that sort of, it doesn't grasp the bigger picture. And I think fair play to West Yorkshire Police. They have an analyst, Mr. Smith, I've forgotten his first name, and Paul Smith. And after Rotherham had happened, he, often in public service you find individuals, don't you, and you think, wow. And so he developed what they call an algorithm. I'm not sure it is an algorithm, but let's go there. And essentially what he did was say, if we put together missing more than twice and put that across, I mean, you'll be aware of this, put it across kids perhaps in children's homes, I think it is, or in child in need. Then they put it across whether they'd ever been on the radar of anywhere in the criminal justice system. Hey presto, you have a completely different cohort. And I think that we say as a system, and I include myself in this, missing is really important, but then it really turns into a transaction rather than, oh dear God, where is this child? Now, if we had rape laws that meant when said child has gone out all night with said perpetrator and his friends, that we will do them for rape, it changes the conversation of the state, really, because rape is seen as one of the most, quite rightly, terrible things that can happen, and particularly terrible things if it can happen to children. So in a way, I'm trying to use the opportunity of this audit to say, how do we reset how we think about children? And it's also why, Dame Karen, I'm so concerned about the whole children's services side of this, in that I think they don't even see those children. So how can you would look at missing, you would look at who's on your child in need, you look at the moment, they just have neglect for most of these kids. I think there's some very profound questions to be asked about what's happening in and around children, of which missing, we call it a red flag. You think some sort of beaming noises, a beep should go off on my phone when Louise Casey goes missing. I'm sure there's plenty of politicians that wish that was possible, but it's sort of, and yet it's not. It's like, well, have you got the returning home interview right? Yeah. And I think we're just in the not right place on it, and it screams out of the voices of the kids in this report.
It's the lack of joining up on all of this and the lack of all the agencies.
Exactly.
And I was thinking earlier about when you were leading on troubled families, and I worked with you on that.
Exactly.
The joining up made all the difference, and we simply haven't joined up on all of these different red flags that absolutely should be front and centre, and the agencies, and I'm afraid there's a tendency, tick the box, I've done my job, I've covered myself, I've covered my colleagues, but I'm not going to apply judgment, and I'm not going to join this up, and that needs to change.
I 100% agree.
Thank you. Chris Murray.
Thank you, Chair. Firstly, thank you all three of you for this very important report that you produced. I just want to go back into that question of when you decided to call for a national inquiry, because we had Alexis J here, we had Tim Crowther here. You said yourself your own views evolved on the need for a national inquiry, and I cannot tell you how shocking it was to read, or how disappointing it was, those pages in your report of the timeline of how little has happened over the years. And I worked on anti-trafficking for 4 years, and I've spent so much time reading reviews like this, submitting evidence. There's been task forces, there's been reviews, there's been inquiries. My question is, how do we ensure that there just is not more delay? How do we ensure that this new national inquiry does not become... I understand completely your reasons for calling for it, which you've set out really comprehensively, but how do we stop people in the system using that as like, well, that's for this national inquiry, we're not going to move forward on that? And can I ask you specifically, we will have the Home Secretary at this committee in 6 months' time. Which of your recommendations should we say to her, have these been implemented yet? So we use this inquiry, your report, as a fire break on, so there's action and not just more discussion.
So, to the last question, the reason that there's so much that we could want to come from the audit findings, and we zeroed in on 12, and we did that deliberately so that we looked at what we thought would be the most significant 12. in order to get the biggest change possible. So obviously I have strong views on other areas, such as serious case reviews, just to put that back in. But we zeroed in on 12, and I think that I would like you to hold to account the government in 6 months' time for what action has happened on all 12. I don't think that's an unreasonable thing. That if I'd done 300 or 200 or even 50, I think that gets tricky. But we did 12, knowing that we wanted some big shifts. So I think the other thing, just on the National Inquiry, look, you have to see the National Inquiry and the National Criminal Exploitation, Criminal Investigation. Thank you. Sorry, it's been a long 12 hours. Yes. You have to see the National Criminal Investigation and National Inquiry almost conjoined. They can't be for different reasons, because we need the Inquiries Act statutory powers available to the National Inquiry. But I would like to see, and I listened to what the Home Secretary said in Parliament yesterday, I would like to see quite a significant uplift in the prosecutions, the action, the criminal investigations on child sexual exploitation, both historic and current. I'm very mindful of what Mr. Maguire said about some historic victims who actually really don't need to be brought before more national inquiries to account for what's gone on. I don't think we need, unless they want to, lots of sort of victims that have already given evidence elsewhere. What I'm concerned to do with the National Criminal Investigation is go after the criminals whose victims have not got justice. So it's where there is a gap, not a sort of, or where actually the prosecutions weren't good enough. So that's the first thing. And then the second thing is, I think that we've put it in the recommendations that we've got a sort of formula, we think, about how the National Inquiry could think about, therefore, where that took you locally. There are some places that people may want to crack on with in the shorter term, but certainly over time, and I don't think it needs to be forever, if you had areas where clearly there haven't been national criminal convictions or local, criminal convictions, and suddenly we're finding them, you'd have to ask yourself why we're finding them now and why we didn't see those children 10, 20 years ago. But a lot of this has to be driven by the victims. It has to be proportionate around the victims, but we see them jointly together. And I don't know, I think because of the publicity, which is both sad in some ways but important in others, the attention this has had politically, here we are, less than, not even 24 hours since that report was laid in the House, and I'm before you with my team. It shows that I hope this is a line in the sand, and I think the 12 things that we're asking for are not impossible, they're not pipe dreams, they're achievable.
Thank you very much, thank you for that. A couple of other questions. So firstly, one of the things I thought was quite, this is a genuine question, one of the things that was interesting that was missing from the report is any discussion of the pandemic and that huge impact that has had on child protection, on the way abuse is perpetrated. I just wondered if you wanted to say anything about that.
Well, if you want to ask me to do another report in 6 months on that issue, I'm not happy to do so, but I'd be open to negotiations. The truth is that there is a huge dynamic at play around what's happened since the pandemic, both not just in crime, but into the lives of children and what's going on. I think I was quite vocal during the pandemic that we ought to look at the implications of it, and we shouldn't leave people behind. I'm still of that view on a personal level, but this piece of work couldn't stray too far from its establishing the facts in relation to child sexual exploitation by gangs, and we only had 3 months to do it in. And I can assure you, in terms of all of the projects that I've been involved with over the years, this has been tough to achieve in the time period. I had to ask for a 2-week extension just to double down on the final facts, actually, to be sure what we were getting in terms of data from colleagues in police forces that wanted to clean their data before it went public. So it was quite tough to get just this body of work done in 3 months. So I'm sorry if we didn't get to wider issues, and I think it's important that somebody does. I really do. I'd support that.
Okay, thank you. And another question is, you talk about it's really important to collect ethnicity and race data, and you've set out really comprehensively why that's the case. But I just think about other kind of child sexual group exploitation that we've seen. So there's been significant ones in the Catholic Church. Also in my city of Edinburgh, there's been significant challenges in boarding schools. And I just wonder, are there other data points we should be collecting? Religion, for example, would be one. But are there other markers, you think, or I just wonder why ethnicity and race have been singled out so specifically? I mean, I understand why, but why not others?
So chapter 4 of the report looks at what we call the nature and characteristics of child-based sexual exploitation. It's not an academic exercise of interest, finding out what it looks like. It's actually for important reasons of understanding offending and being able to, by understanding it better, being able to tackle it better. So there's a whole range of things in that chapter, including ethnicity. Ethnicity stands out as one of the areas where data collection has been really poor, where it's been seen as an optional extra. But there are lots of others in there, and we've spoken about some of them. The vulnerability factors associated with victims, for example, understanding those like missing episodes and so on, can be really important in better tackling offending. All of the demographic information is important, and we go through it all in that chapter. I would say that applies more broadly to crime in general. It's really important to understand who is being affected by crime and who is committing it, and where there's overrepresentation of certain sections of society, whatever that might be, age, sex, religion, culture, nationality, ethnicity. Those are important things to understand in order to work out how you better protect the victims and prosecute the perpetrators. And
I think the other interesting thing about this, it's interesting as a sort of been around a long time, is that you don't always have to collect national data. You could actually have done a deep dive. Policy making can be done in many different ways. I think that the issue is that people don't always find looking at ethnicity straightforward in certain circumstances. In some ways, they find it really easy to look at it, look at the Metropolitan Police and Black Londoners. So, there's an irony to sometimes we decide to find this data writ large, and then other times we decide not to. So, I'd add religion into that as well. You could easily run a deep dive into a set of data to establish all sorts of drivers, but nobody's bothered. Sorry, that's too harsh. Nobody has seen it as a priority. And I think sometimes my main view about these things is that if the good people don't grasp difficult issues, there's plenty of bad people out there that will grasp them for you. So I'm always a believer, no matter who is in power. I've worked for several prime ministers, several different administrations over the years, and my advice to everybody always is get ahead of trouble and grasp it, because you're a good person, and there's plenty of people out there that grasp the bad stuff and make it even worse than it needs to be.
Absolutely. You mentioned in your report that...
Alexis J did an absolutely stunning job of holding institutions like the Catholic Church and the Church of England to account, and children's homes. Her and her team, her fellow commissioners, journalists and victims have pushed it and pushed it and pushed it, and she lifted that lid and showed it for what it was. And I think now, I hope nobody in the Catholic Church or others deny what happened and what their priests did to children. And if they did, they should face the same consequences of any other individual. So I felt it's important to say, because I think it's really important that we don't think that Alexis J and her team left anything they should have done, they didn't do. They did a really good job, and we do need to implement the findings, and we do need to own that large institutions unless they're careful, can go easily into losing their way. And that's every institution, I think, not just religious institutions.
Thank you. In the report you talk about, I want to ask about the national referral mechanism and its interplay here. So you can talk about the 49% increase in NRM referrals for sexual exploitation since 2020. How useful a tool, because the NRM is kind of broken right now, how useful a tool is that to addressing the challenges that you've seen in your audit? And specifically, I want to ask about the pilot for devolved decision making, because I asked the Home Secretary about this yesterday and she's committed to rolling it out. Do you think that will move the dial on this? Am I pushing in the right direction there?
Well, we looked at the national referral mechanism and the data on those who come into it for reasons of child sexual exploitation. We were looking at it in relation to trying to understand, again, let's try and understand the scale and nature and if this was a sort of different path in. We didn't really go into the policy of it within again kind of within the time. We weren't able to sort of interrogate it, but we can see, of course, that it was interesting from our perspective to think about the kind of trafficking side of child sexual exploitation, which you know comes up a lot, and obviously it's very interesting the way that children end up in the NRM when they might end up, they should be ending up in a different route or might come through a different route. But we didn't really look at how the policy has developed. Right. So I'm probably this isn't the right sort of area of for us to comment on that.
And then, sorry.
I'm going to bring in Paul Kohler now.
Thank you, Baroness Casey. I want to go back to that point you said about victims a few minutes ago. I totally understand the reason why we mustn't over-traumatise them again or re-traumatise them again. But I watched on Newsnight last night. I was hugely moved by the testimony of the two victims who appeared with you on Newsnight. But I was also hugely impressed by their ideas, their desire to change. Have you any thoughts on how we might use victims who want to creatively, not just as passive givers of evidence, but actually help us change the system?
I think that's a really good point, actually, Mr. Kohler. I think that my understanding is that the new government wants to establish a victims panel precisely for that purpose, to involve them in the policy making and decisions. I don't know where that's at. I don't work for the Home Office, but if you wanted to ask them about that, I think that would be a really good thing to ask them about. I think they made that commitment publicly, and I'm not sure where it's at. And I think the purpose of that panel is to go a bit beyond reliving your trauma and a bit more into specifics. And I think it's a really interesting point you make, actually, that I think in some ways the Newsnight piece and various others are allowing people publicly to say what they think should shift. And I think that's quite, I'm really open to that. It's partly the sort of session we had with survivors and victims was less about the trauma they'd experienced, but actually more about what they think should happen now and what type of things would help them. And I would say we covered off a range of things, but it was part of why I thought that the fact that they feel that nobody is straight, that they're not candid, that they don't really know what's going on, wasn't just about their own cases, it was wider. And that's partly, it was another part of why we came to the view that we should settle on a national inquiry. And I think that the other part of the national inquiry with its local footprints is that I think it would be helpful to make sure that, yes, inquiries are there to establish the facts, to apportion blame, to use inquiry language, and to make sure it doesn't happen again. But it would be a missed opportunity not to use that victim's voice to say, so what specific things do you think we need to change? So when I was the Victims Commissioner, actually under the Coalition in 2010, 2011, going back a bit, I remember meeting victims, and one of the specific things that one of the families wanted was that prisoners that had been convicted for killing their partners could not arrive at the Court of Justice and Family Proceedings and argue for custody directly with the family whose mother they had killed. And my jaw dropped, thinking, here I am thinking I know a bit about the world, and I had no concept that we allowed that to happen. And it seems like a very small change, but it was a change I think that government or its successor, Conservative government, put through, and that was because of those victims, and I introduced them to various ministers and it went forward from there. So I think, you know, I was struck last night by both Fiona and I was struck by how practical they are in terms of what they think should change, and I think that's always helpful.
Thank you.
And I have an amendment to the Crime and Policing Bill around the issue of parental rights for offenders, so I'm hoping the government will do something positive on that. But we're going to go on to the national inquiry and local inquiries, and Robbie Moore.
Thank you, Chair. And Baroness Casey, can I just say a huge thank you to you and your whole team for the amount of work that you've put into producing these recommendations. It is hugely, hugely appreciated. I just want to focus my questioning on the national inquiry and then local inquiries as well. And I want to start just by referring to page 137 of your report, which you make reference to Greater Manchester and Rochdale as two areas that have shown a reluctance to review past events, and they're not the only two areas that have shown that reluctance. And you pointed to the fact that they were confident that practice had improved, or that issues that had been covered elsewhere, often citing other serious case reviews. Now, I'm just going to use the example of Fiona Goddard, who I know that you met last night, but she was a constituent of mine as well as living within the Bradford district. And she has obviously made her views known. She removed her anonymity and has been quite critical of how decisions have been made in the past. One of her absolute frustrations, when I spoke to her last night before the Newsnight interview that she did, was that this feeling that local authorities, and I'm going to reference Bradford Council because that's my own local authority, indeed where she resides, are using serious case reviews, indeed hers, and indeed referencing the thematic review, which you referenced in your report that was produced in 2021, which only looked at 5 children. It was only a 50-page document, of which Fiona was one of those 5 children. Yes. And heavily relying on that, and dare I say her serious case review, as a reason that there is nothing more to see here in this area. So I think the simple question is, we've had the announcement quite rightly that we're having a national inquiry, but we still have the reluctance that's coming forward at a local level for any more of a spotlight to be shone across the Bradford district. So what would your message be to local leaders that represent Bradford Council and indeed the wider West Yorkshire area of how we absolutely reassure victims and survivors like Fiona that we can have that inquiry that is focusing on the Bradford district that Fiona has called for and still calls for, and I have been for a significant long period of time? So
I'll come to Bradford in a second. The first one you mentioned was the where we talk about Rochdale. So just, sorry, I may not have made myself clear earlier. So I think Andy Burnham did a good thing in Greater Manchester to say, I'm not happy with what's going on here. He listened to victims, he did talk to the police, he did talk to others, and he tried to put in place. He did not try, sorry, that's unfair. He instituted assurance reviews, if that's what they called them, to try and establish exactly what you're wishing, I think, for Bradford. And 2 good people did them. I met one of them, who I know was in Commissioner in Rotherham when we were there, and they only got so far, because essentially they couldn't require people to give them information, they couldn't require people to give them, appear before them, they couldn't, didn't have any ability to do hearings, and as I think we put in the report, it just went on and on and on, and then they did this work, but nobody It took a long time before anybody said, as in the new Chief Constable, who said, yeah, we didn't get this right and we're sorry to victims. And that's why we put it in there to say, even when you have actually the Police Crime Commissioner, which is what the mayor is, where you have a Police Crime Commissioner or a mayor that says, I want this to happen, and he spends money getting it happen, it didn't get him what he wanted, which was accountability on behalf of the victims and the system is what happened. So that's why I, again, just doubling down on that looking at that, interviewing various people, we came to the view that without statutory powers, for Inquiry Act type powers, you're not going to get anywhere. And then I agree that if you, I would say, if you were Bradford, if you were anywhere in my report that we published yesterday, if you were any of the areas that are sort of visible and identifiable, just be ready and be open to the fact that you may be the subject of one of the national inquiries. And I would be surprised if some of the areas that I mentioned, probably including Bradford, would not be subject to being part of a national inquiry. And it's absolutely right that I think members of Parliament, I think victims, I think other people are able to say, we want this to happen here, and that should be balanced out with what I think should be, dare I say, an evidence-based and data-led approach to looking at where you would start and where you would head. So I didn't want Mr Moore today to get into, this is my hit list, let's just use common parlance, or, you know, dare I say it, this is where I think you should start, because I don't think that was my job. My job was to establish a different set of facts. Do I think you can look at the audit and make that part of your decision-making process, whoever is going to take that role on? I think I probably would if I was theirs. And I think, and I'm sensing and understanding, having met Fiona and seen her previously on Newsnight, good for them for giving her that voice, the government will need to move relatively quickly on making a headway on starting some local, doing the national inquiry, running into some of these local inquiries and getting on with them, because I think the sooner we get on with them, the sooner we can get accountability on the table. And even if we can never, ever do right by the victims, because at the end of the day, the people that did those crimes are the perpetrators, we can at least get the system to look at where it needs to apologise, where it should be accountable, and where it should make redress. So I'm sorry, it's a very long-winded question to your answer, but I thought it was important just to be as open about what I think is possible.
I really appreciate your response there, because the excuses, dare I say, at a local level, first of all started off about it being too expensive and therefore it wasn't warranted. Then it turned into the fact that we would learn nothing new. And this, as an element of communication that's coming out from Bradford Council, and dare I say our West Yorkshire Mayor as well, is that it is very much reiterating the points in your report where you were referencing other places like originally Greater Manchester and Rochdale before things changed under Mayor Burnham, for example. So the question I then have is, are you satisfied if we still have this reluctance this reluctance to accept that we need to have a spotlight shone on the Bradford district? Do you feel that your recommendations are providing the Home Secretary with enough of a direction and, dare I say, powers to be able to utilise through those recommendations to be able to ensure that a spotlight could, should it be chosen, be shone on Bradford?
So the first thing to say is I naively really I didn't necessarily see that the Prime Minister saying he wanted a national inquiry on Saturday would somehow turn into quite the bigger deal that it did. Perhaps that's my naivety, because my head is right in the middle of this and the victims and what we should be doing. Perhaps I misjudged that slightly. I absolutely thought that this was the right thing to do. I thought the decisiveness, to be fair, of the government in basically within a week, saying, OK, we're going to do this. And then the inquiry was announced on Saturday, and the full announcement of the law changes, the criminal investigation and the inquiry, because they are a package, I urge people to consider them as a package, was announced only yesterday. I think that's pretty good going in my career in getting governments to do things I want them to do. I felt quite all right about that actually last night. By the time I tripped over to Newsnight, I thought, job done, mate. Anyway, but I take what you're saying and I understand it. And I think that what I would say is the Home Secretary made clear yesterday the government's commitment to all of what was in there, including a national inquiry with local footprints. It's the same Home Secretary that in January said, here I am, I think there's something that needs to be looked at here, here's 5 local inquiries, we're going to follow the Telford model that many people across the political divide have supported. Nobody came forward. She will have noted that herself. We discussed it when we met between my handing in the report and now, and had the same conversation about why I have shifted my position. And she herself noted that areas didn't exactly knock her door down to want to do these local inquiries. The statutory inquiry powers were announced on Saturday. They were given in full to the House yesterday. Any area of the country, I would urge them, Bradford, anywhere, to think carefully about not being open to scrutiny and to change. And I would urge them to think carefully, and I realise it's nerve-wracking because in the midst of all of this are some human beings that are leaders, and I don't mean political leaders necessarily, but social workers, team leaders, police officers, where we all know that when it gets nasty, they are named and very nasty people can do very nasty things to them. Like, you all know that, your MPs, other public servants too. So we've got to be careful about not scapegoating people and creating a sort of hate monger thing at the same time that we have to make sure that we get the inquiries right and that people are held to account locally. So I would say to anybody who can see themselves in this report, be open to it. Don't use... I mean, you're telling me what we wrote. You're absolutely right. You know, there are areas that have said, we've done serious case reviews, therefore we don't need to do anything. That is not the case when you look at the serious case reviews. It does not answer the question. Serious case reviews, the public may think, and I used to, that they are a way of holding kind of what actually happened and how can we not get it right again and who's accountable for not getting it right. That's not what they have done and that's not what they do. So you can't use them as a reason not to do an investigation when you're looking at these issues. And I would say that to Bradford and anywhere else in the country. I would caution against doing that and say, let's be open. Let's use this as a moment to draw a line and to have a national reset. That's what I would say.
Thank you. And openness, transparency and accountability is incredibly important, and that's absolutely noted. Which brings me on to my next question, is to do with terms of reference associated potentially with the national inquiry. Because I know that you, West Yorkshire Police fed into your report and helped with, I suspect, then the recommendations that you then came to. But as one of the concerns that gets raised to me is it's multifaceted, and this has been picked up in terms of some of the comments that you've made today, in terms of it's not just police forces, it's local authorities. In fact, it's any organisation, effectively, that has safeguarding responsibility, including the CPS. So how do you envisage the terms of reference being established, and how do you a reference getting cross-government buy-in? Yes, it was the Home Secretary that gave the announcement, but actually this cuts across every government department as well. So would you just like to expand on that?
And if I could add to that, and it's the question I put to the Home Secretary yesterday, how do you make sure that you don't prejudice criminal trials by, because clearly in the inquiry we want openness, we want honesty, but sometimes that openness and honesty is provided on condition of some form of amnesty or a lack of prosecution. And we can't have a situation where in an inquiry we find a perpetrator who's guilty of potentially many crimes that can't then be prosecuted because the inquiry has taken evidence. How are we going to ensure that doesn't happen?
Well, and I think the issue of misconduct in public office is always quite a tricky one to investigate and prosecute. Actually, if that's that's where you end up. Sorry, not suggesting that one does, but it's always been quite tricky, that one. I mean, to be honest, the 3-month sprint to get to where we are, no, West Yorkshire Police were not involved in the recommendations. We took from West Yorkshire Police the Smith algorithm and the good work that they're doing in terms of their organised and criminal exploitation. We took their data, we analysed it, and we went backwards and forwards over that. But the recommendations are very much ours and mine, and frankly, not with masses of consultation with anybody. In fact, I don't think we consulted with anyone. So, because this was a contested and tricky thing, and it's on my shoulders to attempt to get that right. And so, no, we didn't enter into a process of consultation with anybody at all. So as to the detail of how you get all of that right, I honestly think there's a few you'll have to get the terms of reference right. Do I think that's an impossible task? No, I don't. Do I think that people might use excuses as to why you can't do these things because of the very reasons you said? That's a possibility. Do I think we should all watch that very carefully? Yes, I do. And do I think we can crack on with this? Yes, I can. The Inquiries Act gives scope to do things in different ways. We don't have to always do them in exactly the same way. That's what the Inquiries Act gives you. And if it needs to change, there's a government in power that can change it. So I haven't really scoped out and got to the detail of terms of reference, but I think it's pretty clear what we want, and I think it's pretty clear why we want it, and I think the government has accepted it unreservedly, and I have huge confidence in them across the board, actually, to implement it. And I have to say, I thought it was quite a moment to see the government bench with women right across the board yesterday. The Home Secretary was surrounded by her Secretaries of State and other people that are active. And, I think a lot of parliamentarians across the political divide have contacted me in the last 12 hours to say thank you and well done. And that goes across the political spectrum completely. It really does.
Thank you. Thank you. Paul Kohler. We've got a couple more questions, if that's okay.
Okay.
Carry on with the national inquiry. It's coordinating a number of local inquiries, drawing generic lessons from that. But do you envisage it going further? This sorry, this awful tale is a systemic failure in the body politic at every level, local, regional, national. A failure of self-reflection, which we saw in the House yesterday. Are you envisaging it talking about the failures at every level of government, including national?
So I think the important thing, again, about giving the panel or the inquiry chair or chairs is that by giving them statutory powers of that nature, they are able to go wherever they think they need to go.
That's a good answer.
Well,
Thank you.
It's the truth.
We've set out a prescription under that recommendation to a degree. Obviously, it's for the government to work out how they detail that, but having an independent commission overseeing that, agreeing set terms of reference and timescales and so on, is an important part of that process. And it's in setting the terms of reference that scope is really determined, and then how the Inquiries Act powers are applied and how they're used, for example, to overcome conflicts of evidence with criminal and other prosecutions and so on.
And so you don't see it as restricted to then just coordinating this regional? No, that's great. Absolutely. Thank you.
It is evidence-led.
Thank you. And one further final question. What cultural and again, this might be premature, you might not want to have a comment on this, but do you have any thoughts on the cultural and societal drivers that were at the heart of these grooming gangs? Is that something you feel able to comment on at this stage?
I think it would be no, actually. I think that what I'd like to see is that we take this carefully and properly, and that what I feel we've known needs to be done, even if it was just intuitively since Rotherham, but certainly now the evidence is there, is that one ought to collect data properly and at the same time It will be a difficult and challenging piece of work to do, but obviously I don't often ask for new research in anything that I do. I'm a let's get on with it type woman. But I think in this situation, we do need to have a bespoke piece of research that looks into whether there are cultural drivers, religious or otherwise. And I also think that that's not unusual in crime fighting. I think there's a sense that that would be an unusual thing to do. It's not, I mean, as you know, so it's quite normal to look at threat and to then investigate and understand what that threat is and why it is and how it is and who they are and where they come from and what might be doing and what type of people they are, whether they're rich, whether they're poor. There's lots of things that you look at around drivers. And I think if we looked at it in that way, and if we'd done this a few years ago, perhaps we wouldn't be here where we are now. So it's not often I recommend research, as you probably are aware, but I do on this occasion.
Thank you.
El Ribeiro Addy.
Thank you, Chair, and I also want to say thank you for all of the work that yourself and your team have done on this. You said at the beginning that you weren't sure if you had done enough, and I think that's a huge disservice to yourself. You've been writing recommendations for a long time, and perhaps if people have listened to them, things might be a bit different. But in terms of those recommendations, some of the work that's going to be going on, I also wanted to ask about inquiries, because we find a lot of the time that inquiries go ahead when there's been a huge moral outrage, and then we want something to be done. And I understand that data does need to be collected, that's very clear, but they are notorious for being costly and lengthy, and I was pleased to see there's going to be a time limit on this. So what's the time limit, roughly?
So I think in anything that we might have said so far, we've suggested sort of 3 years. Okay. Certainly initially, but certainly I think you should be thinking getting the national and local bit done within 3 years. It's partly why we're looking for flexibility about the inquiry model, and looking for perhaps a team effort rather than a single individual running hearings. Probably saying more than I should at this stage, but why not? You've asked a question, so I'm answering it. So, yeah, I think that we're of the view that this is achievable. I just think that we need some creative thinking from colleagues in the civil service to help make it happen.
And could we hope for some interim type of reporting that might help push things forward a bit quicker?
So I thought what was interesting about Alexis J and the way she did her report is she did regular reports. So I thought that was a really good model, and I was really appreciative of that as somebody that was following what is she finding and what we should do. And again, I think I know that's not what other inquiries do, but I thought Alexis J and her team did that really well. And again, it would be obvious that why would you wait if you've got a local inquiry done somewhere? You don't need to wait 3 years before you publish it. You need to get that out there, get on with it, and get people moving on.
And in terms of the 12 recommendations you put forward at the moment, I know they've all been accepted, and I know that you've already said to colleagues today that there's not any particular ones that you would think we should be pushing for. So I suppose I wanted to ask slightly differently, do the government have the full capacity to implement them, and are there any that they might find more difficult than others that we might be able to push on?
So I think changing the consent law, there'll probably be an awful lot of people that think we don't need to do that. Okay. I think those people will be legal eagles that say the law is already there and we use it. I would caution that. The number of rape convictions for under 13-year-olds is double for those between 13 and 16. That Sarah reminded me kindly of that fact this morning, so I was ready in case anybody said we shouldn't change consent. You very kindly not asked me that question, which has been marvellous. But I'm worried about that one. The other one, I'm not worried about it. I'm worried societally about it, if you see what I mean, not about the government. The other one I think that will be difficult for them to get right, as in the government, is actually quashing convictions isn't going to be straightforward. So quashing convictions when you've got a single crime, prostitution, great, government committed to that, recommitted to again yesterday. I can see how you would pick that particular crime, search, prostitution, go and find quash convictions. Brilliant. I'm making that sound straightforward just because I'm conscious of time. It won't be as straightforward as I've said, but I think you can... The problem about child sexual exploitation is that in some of the cases, it is not prostitution alone. It could be criminal damage. It might be that the young woman introduced her friend to these people, and then she has been done for essentially introducing a child to sex abuse or whatever that criminal charge is. Inciting a child. And so I think it will take a bit more than, hello, why don't you go to the Court of Appeal and get that sorted? It just won't cut it. And so what will happen is people like me, but also the victims themselves, and outstanding organisations like the Centre for Women's Justice will continue to have victims who have not been heard sufficiently, where we could look at how we quash their convictions. It would just take more effort and more complexity than is straightforward. So they would be my two. So I think some of these legal changes are quite tricky, and then I think the other two is I really want people that have done these crimes locked up. And so I think in the noise and haste over inquiries, I would urge such an auspicious committee as this one, such a powerful committee of this one, to hold not just the government and the Home Secretary within the government, but the police and all other parties, the people that could help the police in health, the people that could help the police in children's services, to bring the men that perpetrate these crimes to justice so we can lock them up. And just two very quick ones. I note that the issue of race, and I welcome the fact that you've challenged it quite robustly, has really been quite loud, and even within the report and the Home Secretary's statement, we've touched on the issue of asylum seekers and immigration and race, and can be synonymous. But a lot of the time, these issues are about closed patriarchal groups of men, which we've pointed out exist in all races and all ethnicities. They even exist in this house. They're the scourge of the earth, if you want to call them that. How do we make sure that we focus on targeting them? Because sometimes when that noise comes about, and it has come about in this reporting, it shifts the focus away from the victims, and that's been the saddest thing. We focused on groups of perpetrators and not the victims. That's a really important point and good question, is that I almost feel that because we haven't done the job right around collecting ethnicity properly, it means that, in a way, the bigger issue, dare I say it, which is men's violence towards women, is in danger of being lost. And so I think that, I think in a way that's why it feels that is something that all of us in society, there are so many good men that, need to step into the space of helping to do something about that, not just around child abuse, but more generally. And if we're still arguing over data around ethnicity, we won't get to the bigger issue, which is no matter what ethnicity, religion, age, or whatever, why do men commit these offences against girls? And you can do all of some women, some are men, boy victims. Child sex abuse that we're talking about today is largely men, if not nearly all men, against girls, and some of them are young. So I think I'm with you on that. I just think that in a way, until we get this stuff sorted from a policy level, the point you're making will continue to be missed.
And just finally on the victims, and I suppose what seems to be happening overall, and some of my colleagues have touched on it already, in terms of the agencies that are involved around them. We already have quite robust legislation, it seems, to protect children. It seems like we do. You could apply it in a certain way. We even have good legislation, I suppose, in terms of rape, in that you can receive a certain conviction. The problem is that people don't actually get to court, and that it seems that these issues of child sex abuse don't get to a point where they're being prosecuted. How and it was the issue of, I suppose, agencies not talking to each other. It's very clear from all of the reports that a lot of these young people have come from care, particularly social economic backgrounds, are in certain situations. How do we get from the focus from, I suppose, the justice element, which is important, to actually putting resources into tackling some of the root causes and, I suppose, the roots of where some of these victims are specifically coming from? Because the focus of the work is important in terms of tackling it, but we know that some of these children are coming from particular situations, and we never seem to be doing enough on that.
At this point in my life, I wonder whether we will ever be able to do enough to protect children if we don't establish how we can have families that are able to look after their children in a way which means they don't end up in difficulty. And good families end up with kids in difficulty, incidentally. Let's not get me wrong. And I think today's been about this particular issue, but if you think back to from when I was working in homelessness in my 20s, through to antisocial behaviour in my 30s, through to whatever it was, respect and family intervention in my 40s, and then troubled families in my 50s, through to integration reviews and going back in during COVID to try and help families. And what goes right across that is exactly what you're saying, which is, if we prioritise children over and over and over, and today I'm asking people to prioritise children that are adolescents and teenagers as well, and that if we did right by that as a society, and that's why the rape conviction does mean a great deal to all of us on the team, then I think we're starting to talk again about what kids are. And I think I've had a long go at trying to you can call it, what do we call it, social exclusion, social mobility, social justice, troubled families, and now I'm before the Home Affairs Select Committee. The issues are the same. We just look at them through different lenses. But I'm really conscious. I'm with you. I just think right now there are victims of this particular type of crime that we're not doing enough for, and so I think we need to do a bit more for them. Doesn't mean we give up on all the others.
Would you indulge one very short question from Jake Richards?
Very, very short. Just looking over the history.
Just because your sister is the special advisor to the Home Secretary doesn't get you special treatment, Mr. Richards. I
have declared that interest previously for the record. When necessary to do so. I can assure you that it doesn't get me any special treatment. Quite the opposite, actually. Looking at all the reviews and work that has been done on this issue over 10, 15, 20 years, and the complete profound disappointment at the lack of progress. There's going to be another inquiry that we've discussed today. Is there force to the argument that this needs something else, a constant, something new, a constant authority figure, such as a child sexual exploitation commissioner, to constantly keep the heat on?
So I have to, sorry, I was only joking with you, so it's a very fair
Don't
question.
worry.
But I'm not a massive fan of constant commissioners. I've got to be honest. I've been one, and I've not been one. And I think at the end of the day, ministers are accountable for the policy that they're elected to deliver. I think that you have a safeguarding minister, you have a Home Secretary, you have a Secretary of State for Education. I'm not saying that the commissioners that are in other roles aren't there. I just wonder whether I don't want somebody sitting across the corridor basically saying they're not doing a good enough job, when actually I could have somebody sitting across the other side of the corridor getting the job done. And so I think there always has to be a balance between when you need, you're about to set up a change in law, which will be extraordinary in history for kids in this country. You're about to set up a national criminal investigation that will take millions of pounds to get right. You're going to run a national inquiry. You'll have figureheads for each of those that should be before you being held account for not the inquiry one. You won't be able to do that till they finish. But, you know, they are very publicly accountable for what they're doing. I would probably argue you don't need another one. You've also got a very good domestic violence independent commissioner in Dame Nicola Jacobs. It's like, I don't think we need another commissioner. I think we need to crack on.
Thank you very much. Thank you. You have indulged us, but as always, common sense and very appropriate comments and recommendations. I really do appreciate your time today, Baroness Casey, and your very extensive report, which we will come back to, I know, as a committee. Thank you so much for being with us, and I'll conclude the session now. Order, order.
Thank you.